So I guess just kind of, I don't know, we've been chatting a lot about, what did I say, nerding out on Partridge Chanteclers.
Yep.
Been chatting a lot just about the breed, and we've both been breeding them for quite a while. I've had them since 2009, and you've had them.
Yeah, I remember I called you up in 2011, maybe the fall, and I was like, Chris, I've just watched I think I watched Food Inc. or something like that, and I think it had Joel Salatin in it, and I'd sort of been vaguely familiar with him before, and thought, like, you know, I've got to start growing food. This is important. I know it. And I called Chris up because I knew he was totally interested in this stuff, and Chris gave me the lowdown on what he was doing, which was he had Partridge Chantecler, a variety of ducks at the time, pigs at the time.
Yeah, I might have had pigs by that point.
And gardens, and so I became interested in, from there, that's where it all started for me. That was 2012, 2009, and really I found that there's some interest out there in these breeds. Lots of interest in white Chantecler, a considerable amount of interest in...
The whites are more famous. I mean, there's a lot more information available about where they came from, how they were created, but...
There's a bit of a black hole of, like, what happened to Partridge Chantecler from, like, the 1930s, or maybe post World War II, up until like the 80s.
Rare breeds, heritage breeds. I mean, Partridge Chanteclers are a Canadian heritage breed, which is pretty cool in of itself. But it's not really. It's not the fact that they're rare that makes them appealing. It's, at least this is my opinion. It's their usefulness. Like, they have, I guess, adaptations. I'm going to say that. That's not a word that's used a lot for livestock, but they've got adaptations that have been sort of developed over time that, I don't know, make them a really strong, small scale. You couldn't really commercialize it. You're not going to grow thousands of broilers or something, but they're an excellent sort of homestead, small farm. Even if you're mostly gardening, they're still a good addition.
They're on the top of the sustainability of as sustainable as chickens can be.
Yeah.
They're up there in terms of they can procreate. They are going to survive the winter, no problem.
No problem. They tolerate the heat quite well too, actually, which is another. I mean, given that the climate is not necessarily as predictable, they seem to kind of weather any weather really well. The downside to them is, by being kind of rare, and this is some stuff that we were chatting about, for those who are just starting out, they're a little more difficult to get into. It really kind of speaks to I think the sustainability side of it. You've got to have that sustainability mindset going into it, because you are going to have to do kind of what we've done, and sort of maintain a little population. They're not something that's super easy to just go and get more.
If you do find a place where you can get more of them, you're lucky.
Well, and I think neither of us are really into showing and that sort of thing, which often with poultry, that's a big side of a lot of poultry keepers. Like, there's some breeds that's the only reason they've been kept around, but I think I can go out and say it. For us, it's really, the standard's important, as we were discussing, but the standard is your guide. It's like your go-to to come back to make sure you're kind of going in the right direction, but it really is their production qualities that make it worthwhile in the end. They taste good.
Young birds are all really good, and you should be eating them, I think, if you're breeding them.
Well, and that's probably the biggest thing with, like, why the selection is important, because if you're really doing, and this is any breed of chicken or any breed of livestock really, if you're doing it to try to feed yourself, that's the that's the ultimate way to constantly improve your stock, because when you're starting out, resist the urge to eat the biggest, nicest, plumpest looking birds, for example, because those are likely going to go on to produce you better quality stuff as you grow your flock. Or
I guess we didn't talk about, we can go down this, the pros and cons to keeping birds like this. Your options, if you raise birds, you're either going to bring them somewhere to be processed for a fee, or you're going to have to do them yourself, and that's a lot of work. I understand. I've processed hundreds of chickens myself. Doing them in small batches, like I usually do them in 6 or 8 birds at a time, and when I'm selecting, the first selection I do on a flock that I'm growing out, I go through and I take out anybody that has any deformities of any kind, keel deformities. I check everybody over, and I'm mostly focusing on the male birds at this point, but because they're big enough to eat and worthwhile, and I'll go through and remove anybody that's looking like it's not going to be anywhere close to a keeper until I'm down to a set of, and it gets very difficult to pick which bird's the best because they're all so similar.
And that's actually a nice problem to have when you get to that point, that it gets hard. You don't really hear anybody talk about this, but where it gets hard to pick, especially in the roosters, like which rooster am I keeping when they're getting to that much uniformity, like that's actually a pretty good measure of success, I would say.
Ultimately, what I think I've seen and what I try to select for is slower maturity, and I find that those birds that are slower to mature testosterone-wise actually have bigger skeletons, and they almost look more dinosaur-like in their features, and you might think, well, this bird looks like a crappy bird, but if you just give it another month to grow some meat on that skeleton, they produce so much more meat and such a larger bird.
Well, and I think that's a good point too. Like, this is very specific to Partridge Chanteclers for us because we don't have a lot of experience with other breeds. But I think that's an important part about using any heritage variety of chicken. I'll keep it to chickens for a moment, because a lot of, if you do a lot of looking into homesteading type stuff, or raising sustainability, etc., like a lot of information kind of points you towards like the commercial broilers and sort of using them in a small scale manner, which I mean that works for lots of people. But I think when we talk about sort of that bit of the delayed maturity, we're still talking in, like, the bird is still to a reasonable size by about 20 weeks. Maybe you might get it before that, but it's kind of like that progression over time, right? Like, you don't want these heritage birds to be sort of getting to what you would think is a butcher weight right around the 12-week mark, for example, because you want them to put the growth into the skeleton to be able to hold that frame.
This is just something that I've sort of zoned into, and I've found that over time I've produced better birds, and I don't know if it's because of that. They're better in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and they're better for the purposes that you're raising them for, which is the whole point of having them.
It's one direction. It's a bit of the art form in the breeding. I'll find, like, people have certain lines, and then whatever your aesthetic appeal is for whatever breed you're working with, starts to take on its own thing within the breed. And there'll be the Falconer line of Partridge Chanteclers, and there'll be the Heffernan line, because he has it slightly, he's still working on from the standard, but he's still selecting things in a slightly different way, the way he sees it to be right, or whatever, for him, or whatever. So it's interesting.
And that's a nice thing. There's a lot of flexibility with the smaller livestock, which is something we've kind of talked about a little bit, but like chickens, rabbits would be another thing. Like anything where you can kind of, I say, maintain a population, you've got more than one or two. And then you can actually do that meaningful selection, and you can, like a chicken generation could be as short as 1 year, right?
Yep.
Because in a year's time, she's going to produce offspring, or he's going to produce offspring, and so it's one way to run it. And I think we both kind of take a bit of a hybrid approach, where we will keep birds in the flock as long as they're continuing to be productive and basically, like you say, overall healthy, sort of maintaining their health.
Yeah.
Sometimes birds will stay in their flocks for quite a while, which, without going too far down the genetic side of it, that's handy too, because you could have a given line within your flock or of females, for example, but that female group is still kind of diverse, which yeah.
If you source them, like in my case, I have an original bird from 2012. It's now 2020, so it's like 8 years old, just over 8 years old, and it still doesn't lay eggs all season, but she lays eggs during the spring. I really like that bird. She's kind of foundational to the flock, and her genetics go back much farther than the rest of my flock. So I have sort of a staggered age population of hens that I try to keep, which allows for the maximum genetic diversity in a really small flock. A lot of people don't keep their birds any more than 2 years or something like that, because they think they're not going to be
all out kind of thing.
Yeah, they're not.
And yeah, I don't know. It's having longer term goals, because I think with all of this stuff, and especially with breeds like the Partridge Chantecler, like this stuff doesn't happen overnight. You're like quite a few. You never really get to the end goal, so to speak, because you're always kind of improving on it. But that's the point, and I guess that's part of the. This is just one way that you can sort of keep livestock. You could apply it to anything, really. But if you enjoy it, then these things, it's still work, but it's not work.
Yeah, number one is, I said, I think off camera, that if you're not enjoying what you're doing, like, then stop doing it. Do something else.
Yeah.
Because that's the primary thing here, I think, is...
You're enjoying it. You're still... It's something enjoyable. It's something
there might be parts of it that you hate, but
yeah, there's always something. But overall, you enjoy it, and the nice part of it, keeping something like chickens and sort of working with them like this, is you still get those products out of them. Like, so it's enjoyable, and you get the benefit of meat and eggs and other pieces. I guess another thing, going back to what you were talking about with the sort of doing things in smaller batches, that I think is kind of sometimes viewed as a negative, depending on what people's goals are, but I would say for us, I think both of us, it's kind of a positive that the Partridge Chanteclers are generally so good at reproducing on their own. Like all the birds that I produce for the last quite a few years, since I've been raising them, have been produced under birdie hens, and I'm pretty sure you do basically the same.
Yeah, I've never owned an incubator.
And that's almost nice in a way too, because if a batch is, somewhere between 10 and 20 chickens or whatever she produces, they're not all at the same time, so you kind of have that staggered ability to, focus on this group and maybe this line.
Yeah, they get ready at a certain time if you're doing that. Yeah, you can stagger things. You can work it in to make it flexible.
It makes it a little easier too for doing your selection, because this is something that I think is really important. When you have multiple, lines is the best way to put it, but when you've got multiple lines, it's really nice to it's really important, I think, not to compare them directly to each other. So it's better, like, you have an overall goal of what you want your flock to look like, and that's kind of the standard piece of coming back to, this is what they should be. But when you go through and do your selection, those smaller batches allow you to kind of focus on, the siblings or sort of relations.
It's a relative comparison.
Yeah, you're not trying to just pick the best out of your whole flock. You're trying to pick like the best out of your lines. And while you may not see the change as quickly, I think long term you end up in a better place than if you were to narrow your genetics too much. I'm kind of getting into a lot of bigger concepts when we're kind of really trying to focus on Partridge Chantecler. This is just stuff that goes through our heads. Yeah. Probably part of why we've kept with it so long too, because it's interesting. But leave it at that, because this could become a really long.
You're gonna have to do some editing.
Yes.